This is No Hate Radio.
I'm no stranger to the rain. Oh, no. I'm no stranger to the rain.
Thank you for joining us on No Hate Radio today. We're going to have the first in a two-part series on the issues faced by and dealt with in the lives of LGBTQ persons, and that relationship to theology and to the spiritual life, as well as the general life experiences for the LGBTQ community. I'd like to introduce at this time the Reverend David Franks from Allendale United Methodist Church, and Erica George, who is a social worker in the community, and both of whom will offer their perspectives with respect to the wide-ranging issues that constitute the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, thank you, Don. I'm Reverend David Franks. I'm the Minister of Pastoral Support here at Allendale United Methodist Church. Been here with Allendale as their Minister of Pastoral Support about 1.5 years now, but have been associated with this congregation for 5 years. Came here after some therapy, having taken a hiatus from the United Methodist Pastorate a good number of years ago, when I realized that being a gay man, that there really was not any real opportunity for me to continue in the pastorate as a United Methodist minister. When I was ordained back with full orders back in 1979, there was nothing in the Book of Discipline of the United Methodist Church that prohibited me from serving. However, that changed, and when it did, the discipline then stated that any self-avowed practicing homosexual could not be ordained, and if they were already ordained, could not be appointed to serve. So I went in. I was probably really already in the closet to myself, let alone to the church. But when you get to that age of around 38, people are probably beginning to ask the question, I wonder why he isn't married and having a family, because that seems to be pretty much the standard expectation for United Methodist clergy, to be married and to have a family. But I was still in the pastorate, but then I fell in love with a man. And realized there came a point. It was one thing for me to serve while being in the closet. It was another thing to ask somebody who I loved to go back into the closet, who was already out, in order to be in relationship with me. So it was a time to make a decision. Do I continue in my vocation and my calling, or do I follow where my heart is in terms of who I love? So I took a very early retirement at the age of 42, maybe it was 41. But then went in and served in so many other ways, mostly in providing HIV care at the height of people who were dying from that disease, and did that for approximately 30 years. And then finally took a full retirement, a true retirement, meaning I started receiving Social Security, and then and found my way here at Allendale. Always believing when I felt my call into ministry that God could call me into the church, could call me out of the church, and could call me back in. The thing I wanted to be sensitive to was, where was God calling me to be, and the ways in which I could serve. So here I am at Allendale United Methodist Church, doing the best I can to serve the people here and in this community.
Reverend Franks, thank you very much for giving us that insight and also your personal experience like that. And I'll ask Erica George for the same kind of intro, please.
Of course. Hi, my name is Erica George. I use she, they pronouns. And as Don said, here at Allendale, I've been attending Allendale since 2018. So as of recording, that's about 5-ish years. But some of the other hats that I wear outside of this is I have my master's in social work. And so I feel like my experience as a queer person has always been, I didn't come out until college, and so even after college, and so I was kind of already getting some of that social work training, learning about one of the concepts we call in social work as the person as political, and just how much we fit into the systems of the world. And so I grew up in the evangelical church my whole life, and didn't even have any idea that I could be anything other than, straight and cis until I was just about to turn 21, and I thought that was going to be the worst thing that ever happened to me. I genuinely spent the next couple of years, it triggered a lot of mental health depression, and I spent the next couple of years really, really struggling and feeling like I was being ripped between my faith and who I had come to an understanding that I had just been made to be. And so I would say that a lot of my 20s was spent in that sort of war in my own self and my own spirit. And then I ended up publicly coming out after I graduated with my bachelor's. I'm kind of right on the heels of the Pulse massacre in Orlando. And so I was living in Lakeland, Florida at the time, and I'll always remember waking up the morning after Pulse to a couple of my friends having texted me like, "You didn't go out in Orlando last night, did you?" And just being, out to some people and not out and not feeling like I was being authentic. That really kind of sped up the timeline of when I came out. And I, since then, have done a lot of study. I went to an evangelical or a Pentecostal college. The Pentecostal college would have my head for calling them evangelical. Also for knowing that a queer person went there. But yeah, I grew up in Christian education, went to a Pentecostal college. And so just really had a very difficult time in accepting that. And so I got really involved in a couple organizations that do a lot of work in reconciling the LGBTQ community with the Christian church. And so I did a whole cohort with the Reformation Project, in which we went really, really deep into the scriptures of LGBTQ affirmation. And then really, I would say through that time, came to that peace kind of within myself. I felt like, when I had come out, I had left the church in a way, not necessarily by my own choice, but I just kind of came to this place in my own life where I felt like I had not decided that the church was not for me. And so, I found Allendale through a pride parade and came here, and then have really just stuck and thought I'd come and just kind of check it out. And I guess I'm still doing that because I never left.
All right, Erica, I really appreciate also your story, and hopefully that'll give some listeners, people who might be thinking about these issues, some background, some humanity, some personal things to go into. You used terms, both of you did. Reverend Franks used the term expectations, referring to himself, that in the, depending on what profession you're in, depending on what your environment is, there seem to be a lot of expectations that people have related to what you're supposed to do, the kind of person you're supposed to be. I noted also that you used the term or referred to a period in your life of depression. I don't know that you used the term confusion, but it sounded like depression brought on by, I think what I have recently learned to call it was traumatic theology. In other words, you've got probably some self-worth issues associated with the whole thing. So you both use the term coming out, and some people, I think, I've got to consider in this broadcast that people that may be listening to us may not really know the full meaning of the phrase coming out, and I'd like to ask you some about that. You also refer to reconciliation ministries with the Christian church, and I've learned something about that in the past and probably would like to talk more about that too. And the scriptures, of course, there are, to my low level of understanding, Reverend Franks will have to correct me where I'm wrong, but I understand that there are like 7 scriptures out of the entire Christian Bible that are often referred to as the hammers.
Mm-hmm. The clobber passages.
Yeah, those passages that are used, in fact, used as a way to truly to exclude entire class of people from the full participation of Christian church. So I appreciate incredibly both of your insight into that. You mentioned the Pulse massacre, that being the terrible mass killing that went on in Orlando, Florida. That crosses over into issues of gun control and a lot of other things that are too big to be talked about here. But I guess in a way, one of the things I discussed with y'all before we started this was I wanted to talk about the history of gender identity in America. And that seems a perfect example. We kind of went in this country from Stonewall to Pulse. We can say it in a lot of other ways, but we went from, illegal. It was illegal to even be a person. You didn't have to do anything. It was just illegal to be a person who didn't subscribe to standard heterosexual gender identity. And we went from that through a lot of other things, through Stonewall. And then when I was referring earlier to the changing atmosphere, the constantly changing conditions, I thought that was a perfect example to talk about. We went from Stonewall to Pulse. So I'll start with you, Reverend Franks. Could you talk some about the history that, as you understand it, at least in America, for gender identity, the reason that people wanted to, if they didn't have a, quote, standard gender identity, why they wanted to hide that, why they needed to, what happened in the social system that has changed that from time to time. Could you share some of that with us?
Well, not a full expert on that, but I would really begin by making the distinction between sexual orientation and gender identity.
Okay.
Really, in terms of vocabulary and identification with those terms, sexual orientation, which is a lot of what I would say up until recently, within the past several years, the issue really was around sexual orientation. One of the terms that Erica used that I think is really very common in hers and my experience was the word that she used in terms of authenticity. So what I understand, the whole coming out process, going back to Stonewall, which was really about the whole group of drag queens that frequented that bar, finally had enough in terms of the police coming in and raiding that bar for people being there, basically being queer, and said we've had enough and started fighting back. And that really brought attention to the public of, oh, here's a bunch of men who are, we would say, homosexuals back then, saying, hey, wait a minute, we don't want to be hidden anymore. We are who we are. We are authentically who we are. And it's always seemed to me that is the call of the gospel, for people to come to a place where they can claim themselves as God claims them, as God sees them. And so in later years, we've come now to the place of gender identity, where people, when they look in the mirror, don't identify in terms of their gender by who they see in the mirror. So that's a whole nother area of really development in the life of a population, whether by sexual orientation or by gender identity. I remember when I started doing same-sex weddings, I was calling them same-gender weddings until I was corrected, but really saying, these were same-sex weddings where people identify in terms of their sexual orientation, not their preference. The preference is, whether I like my steak medium rare or medium well or however, but rather of orientation, of being able to say, this is like who I am, just as much as saying I'm a man in terms of my gender identification. I am also gay. The people with whom I most identify with sexually are with other men.
Now, one of the comments I wanted to expand on just a little bit, and I thank you for what you just said, is the notion that this non-acceptance or non-inclusion, exclusion, sometimes I think we trip up on our own words, but that it has had an effect in terms of depression, as Erica brought up, in terms of suicide rates, in terms of a lot of, I'm going to just use an unscientific term, a lot of bad things that have happened to people over and around the issue, whether you call it gender identity or sexual orientation or whatever term you want to use about it. It has caused a lot of harm, a lot of damage to people being excluded from entire phases of life. And I'm doing this to work around to a subject also that Erica brought up, having to do with the reconciliation movement in the Christian church and trying to make, change the course of action there. During the course of your lifetime, and I'll direct this one to Erica, you're in social work, and that's your field. Do you have you seen and do you see today, or not, the higher level of depression, suicide, and mental issues surrounding self-worth, self-esteem, and other things for people who don't have the standard sexual orientation or gender identity?
Yeah. Okay. I feel like there's kind of a lot. I'll kind of respond to try to get all of it, because when David was talking, I had quite a few thoughts too. So kind of to maybe address all of what you're asking. Feel
free for a global answer. I will not say you're non-responsive.
But yeah, David, I was going to say that specifying between sexual orientation and gender identity is so important, and just kind of for anyone I know, we want to make sure that we're accessible to kind of people that come into this conversation with a wide range of knowledge, or maybe are kind of brand new to this topic. And so I think you said it beautifully, if sexual orientation is really who you're attracted to, who you're, want to maybe spend, your life with. You could be, romantically, sexually in that way. And then you have gender identity of this kind of innate sense of self and who just you are. And even within that, we have transgender. That's kind of maybe a typical understanding of, we kind of maybe think of this way of, maybe a woman transitioning to be transitioning into a man, being a trans man, but there is such a spectrum, and there's, non-binary individuals, and there's agender individuals, and even within the sexuality spectrum, there's such a beautiful spectrum of identities. And I think that is one of the biggest strengths of the LGBTQ community, which is, plus community, which is even each of those letters stand for, a different identity under kind of the umbrella of, the queer community. And so I think even starting with that is I think that also can make this conversation a little bit more complicated, because you think you kind of get an understanding of one thing, and then, all this, it feels almost like all of a sudden it's like, oh, I really thought I had this down. And then there's more to learn. Yeah.
Yeah. Even within the queer community,
absolutely.
There is some like, well, what do they mean by this? And what do they mean by that? And why are we having to deal with this?
Yeah.
When we've been always just working with, sexual orientation and just being a gay man.
Yeah.
There's many layers.
Yeah.
And when
Exactly.
and when I think about the history, and I think kind of I say all that to go into, the history of our community, and I think starting with gender identity, that's exactly what we're hearing now, right? It's all about, they're trying to turn all of our kids and confuse our kids and turn them trans. Well, that's exactly what people were saying in the 70s with the Save Our Children movement with Anita Bryant. It was all about in our schools, they're trying to groom our children to become homosexuals, right? And so it's the really the exclusion playbook has really been the same throughout history, and it has kind of shown up in different ways. And so what I, even go back and what I do think is that then there's intersections with, you said kind of as I'm just a gay man of men, and finding places for, women and non-binary people in the LGBTQ movement. There's been growth in places that we have to, still plenty of growth to go about not centering whiteness, even within another marginalized community. And one of the things I think about that is I think about, from an American perspective, from Stonewall and looking at Stonewall kind of going to Pulse and this current violence, I think is a very interesting way to frame it. But I also think that even thinking about non-white cultures, right, had so much honor for Indigenous people, had, places of honor for third genders, for different gender presentations long before what we would consider this kind of Anglo-Western American culture. And so I do think that when we look through history, we've seen a lot in the Crusades and a lot in kind of even making America and all of the horrible things that were done to the Indigenous people in our own land.
Their
land. Absolutely. Thank you. And the colonialism, even talking about, you see the effects of that in kind of putting this, now we're undoing years of harm in all over the world and in different communities, Indigenous communities. I think of, I've heard over and over again about, you wouldn't do so well in Africa. And I'm like, I would have done great before colonialism, came and really funded a lot of this hate that now I've heard that even within the conversations of the United Methodist Church and the delegates from all over the world having kind of different thoughts on LGBTQ issues. So that was kind of a lot in that, but I do think it's just very interesting how so much of this really connects. And
I want to throw out a little idea here in this talk. As I thought about it and was kind of preparing for my conversation with the two of you and knowing the two of you and how much you know about this thing, that there are parallels between what the LGBTQ plus community has dealt with, both de jure and de facto harm, wrong, legal and non-legal, and what people of color have dealt with. In other words, the civil rights movement is not unrelated to what has occurred to the LGBTQ community in terms of the greater society and the way they're treated. And I'm glad you brought up the indigenous people, the Native American people. I had occasion, I think this is one of the things I really want to elaborate on with both of y'all, is that part of my process of becoming, and I'll use the term woke, because I don't see anything wrong with the term woke. Part of my process was I got an opportunity, and I really want to tell you, a privilege and an opportunity to become very, very close friends with a Navajo Indian, a fellow who was, a member of the Navajo tribe. Now, he did not live on the reservation, and you might be surprised to know that his profession was he was a radio communications technician. He lived in a very modern world. He didn't live on the reservation, but he had grown up among the Navajo people, and that was where his culture developed. And I got a chance, because we traveled up a bunch of mountaintops in New Mexico together. I got an opportunity to really one-on-one begin to have at least a little superficial level understanding for Native Americans, particularly Navajo people, and their religion and faith, which he taught me. It has a lot to do with what they call earth, wind, and fire. It's a concept that when you examine it in the context of actually knowing somebody, his name was Rick, by the way, in the context of actually being a friend, being one-on-one with somebody, and you think about these concepts and the fact that the invaders, us, the white Europeans who took over America, felt that everything they did was savage and wrong and had to be changed, and their language had to be obliterated, and we created the infamous Indian schools and all that. And what it did for me is it changed my perception of the Native American culture as something strange, different, and other to me, to what the hell is wrong with that? In fact, in all truth and actuality, didn't they have a better idea? And didn't we mess it up? So my thought is, in an effort to change people because we think, we're going to, quote, do them good, we've almost uniformly caused harm. And in my perception of Rick and other friends, I took time to study about a gentleman named Ira Hayes. He was a U.S. Marine in World War II, and he was a Native American. He was a member of the Pima tribe, and he was a code talker. And he did all kinds of heroic things on Iwo Jima. He was one of the 6 flag raisers. He's one of the only 2 that came back alive. But you know what happened to him? He died at age 32, very ashamed that he came back, very much he was, in my opinion, I learned, he's actually the picture of an honest patriot who had no damn good reason to be one. If you know what I mean. Why was he? Why did the Tuskegee Airmen want to do what they wanted to do? So people in the LGBTQ community share, I think, with, and I want y'all's perception, because remember, I'm the old white guy here. I don't know. Your perception of, are those parallels valid that I'm drawing from my perspective between the life experiences of the LGBTQ community and the life experiences of the Native American or the people of color, the African Americans who were forced here, et cetera? And I'd start with you, Reverend Franks, please.
Well, it's a big question. And it goes to, I believe that in terms of culture, and I've given some thought about it, is culture is a way that by being in community with others of like self, that that there is affirmation for who you are, okay? Whether that's within the African American community or the indigenous American Indian community, or whether it's being within the queer community. But I would say also within each culture is not to equate culture with the word I'm looking for is homogenesis, a sense of that it's all the same, that there's diversity within each culture. So even, and to be sensitive to it, especially when we're looking at another culture from our own, and not to make assumptions by what we see or what we hear, and then to kind of do a monolithic kind of, or a big brush stroke of identifying or saying who that other people are. I think that's important. I think about, for example, my work in doing HIV work. The number of people in the African American community, high infection rates, because of what looked like, at least to me, especially within the religious community, of what it means within a culture to be a part of that culture. You know, so to be queer is not to be really a part of that culture, expectation of, or at least in terms of being seen, except in certain areas. But what I found in that kind of like suppression within a culture, harm being done by the infection rates of HIV because of not being able to be out within a given culture. So there are cultures within cultures, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. What I was kind of going to say in that is I do think kind of within any marginalized community, you're going to have those parallels of ways that they have experienced that marginalization when you look against this broader, you kind of almost say like majority culture, but this expectation kind of what is privileged in our society, which is, you know, being straight, being white, being male, being cis. And so I think that there's certainly, I would say that as and you know, again, just even in all of these conversations, I think the caveat of, you know, everyone at this table right now being white, that there's going to be a level of nuance and depth in this conversation that we just cannot, you know, do not have because we can't
get there.
Yeah, because we're, you know, we would need a person of color, you know, multiple people of color at this table to speak to their experience if we really wanted to get kind of a good, you know, more nuanced look into that. But I'll say that for myself, going through my process of, you know, realizing I myself was queer, what that meant, you know, almost learning my own history, because you don't know it when you don't know it, that I gained so much empathy.
That's the word I want to
hear. And for other marginalized communities. And so I would say, you know, if you kind of look at, you know, well, what have you gotten most out of, you know, maybe being in a community like Allendale? You might say, well, you know, you weren't really accepted you grew up in a church, you weren't accepted in a church, you've been able to get married in a church now. Like, I think the gay thing was probably, you know, maybe one of the most important things. But I think, honestly, being in a community that has prioritized, you know, learning how to be anti-racist, which I am, you know, no one is perfect. But I think in being with community, with people who are different than me, being one of the ones that people would say, I'm different than you.
Right.
You know, bringing that experience as a queer person in the church has certainly opened up the world where I held privilege in other places. And so like I would not say that I really had any sort of way that I'd ever learned how to, look at white privilege until I came out and realized what kind of privilege being straight was. And they're not, and I would say that they're certainly not the same, but I do think that it gives a look. And I think even within, you were talking about people even within, not being able to be out in other cultures. I think that then you get into a conversation of, I think all of our liberation is wrapped up together. And there really is no way to work towards inclusion and equity and all of these things that we want, and we would advocate for in the LGBTQ community without also being involved in anti-racist work, without also being involved in, all of the different types of justice and, in disability justice. And so
if I can jump in real quick.
Absolutely.
I think in terms of, because I like the word and empathy.
Yeah.
And I think it's that we also don't really empathize even an inkling until we expose ourselves, make ourselves accessible to other cultures than the ones in which we find ourselves. And it's one of the things that I think is a real point of difference in a lot of ways here at Allendale United Methodist Church, is that there is a real affirmation of exposing oneself, making oneself available to others who don't necessarily look like you, have the same sexual orientation of you, the same gender identity of you, the same color of skin as you, the same culture from which you come, that there is that whole mix here that for folks coming into it is like, oh, not everybody is white here, not everybody is straight here, etc., and that the conversation and the dialogue takes place. And in that, by doing that, empathy is also strengthened, made more available in how we see one another, feel about one another, and how accepting we are of one another, accepting not by how are you most like me, but how are you most like you. And I really see that what we see, I think, in today's culture, in the political scene, if I can say it, is I really see that where we are right now is the white privileged man's what I call last gasp. The demographics of this country, the demographics of the church, reflecting what's happening in this country, are changing. And what we're seeing is fear around change rather than, and staying within one's, and I use the term very loosely, staying within one's tribe as a way of trying to hold fear off when it's actually the motivation for doing harm. And I think I think the good news, quite truthfully, is changes are going to come. It's coming. And it's here before us. And whether how we go about embracing it, so that I respect and cherish that you are who you are, and that you don't have to be me for me or like me for me to accept you.
I know that one of the things that happened to me in my close association with Rick was that I no longer, and this is true, this is absolute truth right here on this podcast, right on No Hate Radio, I no longer consider Native Americans as somebody else. I embrace the Native American culture. I admire the Native American culture, and I greatly wish that we had learned a lot more from them.
Meaning that you no longer see them as, in some way, whether consciously or subconsciously, less than you.
I do not, and that's the distinction.
That's the difference.
And the other distinction is that it makes me want to reach out and say, how is it that we go about recognizing that? And here's a hard thing, I think, mainly for old white guys. And I can say that. I have a lot of authority about old white guys. And and I can say that change is just incredibly hard. And if you are the power culture, if you're the one that owns the railroad and you run the railroad, damned if you're going to give up running the railroad. And so that's what is at the source of that. Let me add a couple of things, because I'm going to ask both of you if you'll come back for another session, and it will be based on this. I promise you. We won't vary around too much. The words got brought up, and we didn't discuss them this time, about the reconciliation effort in the church, in the organized religion of this country, whether it's United Methodist or who it is, the reconciliation effort, where it is, how it's perceived by the LGBTQ community, where it needs to go, what it needs to do. And of course, in that context, we're going to need to discuss a little of what Reverend Franks, I don't know that he identified it initially, but he taught us about traumatizing theology. We're going to have to talk about these 7 scriptures, the 7, what'd you call them?
Clobber passages.
The clobber passages. That I would like to make that the subject of the next discussion we have on the podcast. And because I think it's more than a subject just by itself, of course. Now, one thing I need to do to be true to the No Hate Radio podcast, and I'm going to do this every time. I created the idea, with the help of others, but I created the idea that we need not only that theme song, because a lot of people don't like country music, but you need to go listen to that song. And then I said, this needs to be about this. Why? In the term, whatever subject we're talking about, the underlying theme needs to be why. We've talked a lot about why today. People see people as different. They're not the same. Whatever the why is. But my other underlying theme that I ask guests and everybody that is involved in this podcast to do about it is wind up every time we have a session, the questions are going to be, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? Let's say that we perceive that what is going on in the country right now, in the world, frankly, because, as you know, the world's on fire. But I'm focusing it on this country. The why is that we've spent our entire history in America, the, quote, land of the free, not living up to our Declaration of Independence, not living up to our Constitution, not living up to the notion. And occasionally we drift a long way from a nation of laws and not of men or people. And we're there right now. We're out there, way out there, weird somewhere. And I say that as a 50-year lawyer. And I say, so the why is that people's attitudes seem to be formulated around us and them, or the other, or fear-based, or anger-based, or competition-based, or some other kind of why, for example, are the Jewish population in America, which is 2% of the people, the victim in 50% of religious-based hate crimes? Mm-hmm. Why is that? Mm-hmm. So the why is a big question, mm-hmm. having to do with the LGBTQ community. Why did we start from that viewpoint? Why did we carry on that viewpoint? Why did we isolate and ostracize whole classes of people, not for anything they did, but for just who they were? Why? But now I want to talk about this. What are we going to do about it? First thing I've done about it as an individual is I got me a electronic genius, a sound man over here, and I got him, and I got him to buy me some great equipment, and we're going on the air to talk about these things because people need to hear more than what we can say in a room to each other, and it seems that right now those who are preaching hate and divisiveness have the control of the airwaves. And maybe we'll never get control of the airwaves, but maybe we'll get a chance to talk to a lot more people than you can just do one-on-one right here with this podcast. But what else are we going to do about it? Is I'm going to suggest, as wild and crazy as it might be, that people do something similar to what I did with my friend Rick, the Navajo. Really get to know somebody. Really, not just words and superficial, but go get to know somebody in one of these marginalized, pick one, there are a bunch of these marginalized communities, and find out if after all that, if you really do that, then can you participate in the hate and division and exclusion? Can you tolerate it? Can you put up with it? Or will you stand in solidarity? Will you be an ally? What are we going to do about it? Can I get y'all to add something to my comment on what are we going to do about it?
I think that kind of linking back with even, and I know we never fully got back to, the stuff about, how the LGBTQ community has a lot of high rates of depression and suicide and all of those things. And I think that I would love to talk about that more at length. But I think that kind of going in, I have to think about this both as a person who's grown up in a religious context and has this kind of context now, and then also who I am as a professional and who the kind of affirming, adult and worker that I get to be kind of through my education. And so I think that one of the things that we have to do is continuing to advocate, whether that's through our churches, through our individuals, and then also just that's a term that we use a lot kind of in the social work realm of advocating for social change, advocating for our clients. But I really do think that a lot of marginalization is rooted in, it has come with the, power against. And so there's a lot of vested power in keeping marginalized communities marginalized. And so it is so important to be one voice in a sea of voices working towards the liberation of all different communities, whether, there's LGBTQ community. So it's, showing up at school board, meetings when we're talking about banning books or outing children, even if you don't have a kid in that school system because they're a part of your community. It's about, holding our elected officials, to account, and whether we can actually change what they're doing, but using our voice, especially in times that we are privileged. And so it's not just showing up for the communities of which we find ourselves in, but communities that we are allies to ourselves. Again, we all kind of carry a very nuanced social identity, but I truly believe that it is, the liberation of one and moving towards liberation for some people and leaving others behind will always give us this incomplete vision of what we can be as a society, what we can be as people. And so, of course, there's 1,000 different things I could say, but I'm just going to kind of really go on that word advocacy and kind of using your privilege and any the power that we all do have as individuals towards affecting change.
So it's worth something to be a voice in the wilderness.
Absolutely.
It's worth it. It's worth something.
Yeah, and I would add to that, it's very important in terms of advocacy to advocate for oneself. And that takes bravery. You have to be brave in a lot of ways. I think Harvey Milk, who was the first elected politician in this country to the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, always kept saying, you got to come out of the closet. You got to come out. And what happened with that, back to what you were saying before, Don, in your question, implicit in your question, in terms of getting to know somebody, so you go, oh, the world is bigger than just me. That what happens in that sometimes, especially in marginalized communities, that sometimes it feels safer to remain hidden rather than to be out. That once the gay community started to, LGBT plus community, start coming out and saying, this is who I am, gave you the opportunity to get to know them. And what happened in that was then over 70, 80% of the American population said, oh, I know somebody. They're my uncle. They're my brother. They're my child. They're my parent, right? And then that's how that then began to change the law. And same-sex weddings, marriages could occur because the population said, oh, I know somebody, and they're not less than me. They're somebody I know and I care about because I've been in relationship to them.
A personalized.
So that's how when you ask the question, what are we going to do about it? And it's about getting to know somebody. You don't get to know somebody until they are who they are for you to know.
Right. I agree with that.
Absolutely.
Very much.
Yeah,
So.
and I think being a member of a community even versus being an ally of community, what the best way to affect that change and use that is going to be different. And so I really like that reminder of self-advocacy. And I think going towards, specifically, members of the queer community is that there's a lot of becoming who you're supposed to, become in that self-acceptance. And then there's a lot of recognizing, that I think all three of us are great examples of how far people can come and how much people can change through their own journeys and through the journeys of others. And so I think also keeping that optimism and curiosity and hope towards a better future while also self-advocating for yourself and not allowing and not feeling obligated to remain in situations in which you are being made to be less than.
I've got one thing, and I like to do this always, is, let's assume that when these events, when they air on the air, some people are going to be listening to this. They're going to be coming from a lot of different viewpoints that they tune in. They just happen to be listening to it. What I would like to ask each of you to do, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, and if you don't want to say so, you don't have to, but after going through this much of the conversation, knowing that there's much more to be talked about, hopefully we'll have another opportunity, but at the end of this one, is there a single message, a single thing, a single statement, something that each of you would like to say to whoever's listening that's saying, I need to understand better, I need to know better, maybe my ideas haven't been formed right. Somebody who is actually open to think. What would you like to say to those people? Any of them that might be receptive to an idea?
I guess the question, I guess the answer, I'm not sure it's not nearly the full answer because it creates more questions, is what do you understand and have you known yourself to be loved? And if you know something about that, or feel like you've been claimed by it, and have claimed it in yourself or in somebody else, then know that those people you do not understand, if you are in touch with that sense of love, might motivate you to want to understand.
Outstanding. Erica?
I think that first of all is just acknowledging how we're all in this shared experience of humanity together. And that every single person who is listening to this is coming from their kind of specific story, and that it holds just as much value as anyone else's story, and that we all are incomplete without each other. And so what I would both affirm and challenge in anyone listening is almost what part of your own humanity are you missing by not knowing people who share a different experience? And how much richer can the world be if we would all, from all of our different places, in all of our different communities, be able to approach each other with that sort of, genuine curiosity, while also putting into account and holding this, individual growth and curiosity against the mirror of some really hard history. And I know for myself, I always think of, I stood on so many queer people's shoulders. Like, for me to be able to come out and have the experience of being able to legally marry my wife in this nation and, have the life that I have come out in the church, I'm standing on the shoulders of so many people who were so brave with their own stories and their own humanity in a time that was even, and however you measure, disagreement, or much more maybe dangerous. And so I think about how many people may need to stand on my shoulders in the next generation. And for anyone, whether you're, whether you're a part of the LGBT community or not, how much healing and how much love you can put into and change you can affect by truly getting to know, educating yourself on really what has happened, and becoming part of the change of moving forward, and that you too will have people who you have not met all the people who will love you, and you have not met all the people that you will love. And so what can you do right now to create a better platform for the people who come after us to stand on and make our world even better?
That's outstanding. I do want to key on one thing that takes courage. You said could be dangerous. My thought is that anytime one seeks to change the status quo in any environment, it requires a certain amount of courage. And in the theme song, Keith Whitley says, I'm a friend of thunder, and is it any wonder lightning strikes me? Ride the wind, dance with a hurricane. Those are things. Courage can be identified in a lot of different ways. It can be Rosa Parks on a school bus. It can be somebody standing in front of a school board meeting. It can be holding signs on a street corner. It can be those things, but it's going to take courage. And I guess everyone has a certain level of commitment to things. Dr. King felt like that one of the, I guess, unconsciously enemies of the African American freedom movement were those who were kind of soft, kind of moderate, kind of, I take it this way: I'll advocate for a black person on Tuesday. or whatever their kind of deal was. Everybody that's ever listened to me for any length of time knows that I'm a down-home Texan, and we got a thing we say there. If you're going to be an ally, if you're going to be an advocate, if you're going to stand up for love as the cure for what's going on now, which I think most people would say is bad, not everybody, run with the big dogs or stay on the porch. And with that, thank you for listening to No Hate Radio. Thanks to Erica and David Franks. I'm going to ask you now to come back for one when we talk about reconciliation of the Christian church, by the Christian church with the LGBTQ community and what that means to you. One more session.
Absolutely.
Any final words?
It may take more than one more.
Yeah, it may. Thank you for listening to our broadcast today. We appreciate your interest and invite your input either by calling our message line at 442-4-NO-HATE and leave us your thoughts, comments, ideas, or suggestions, or send us an email by using the email link on our website, or directly email us at nohateradio@allendaleequityjustice.com.